Well, hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about theme and variation form. So I want to give you a little bit of background information on this. What I'm going to do first is to talk about theme and variation during the Baroque era. In the textbook in chapter 13, Stein lists 4 basic types of theme and variation. So I want to go through those with you and play a couple of examples and explain basically how this works. So theme and variation form is one of the most basic, oldest forms in Western music. It's very straightforward in the sense that a theme is composed and then variations follow which have something in common with the theme but then change the theme in some way. So as far as the number of variations, the length of the work, that would be totally up to the composer. During the 17th century, this form becomes extremely popular in Western Europe, and so especially popular with keyboard composers. And so some of the earliest examples of these Baroque works are 4 keyboard and collections such as the Fitzwilliam Virginal Book, which has about 300 keyboard pieces composed by composers such as William Byrd, John Bull, Orlando Gibbons, and so forth. So basically the way that you're going to look at a theme and variation movement is to analyze the theme, and you need to look to see exactly what the chord progression is, how the phrasing is organized, how many phrases, basically the cadences, just to get a good feel for exactly how the theme is constructed. Usually the composer is going to write a theme that is in a very basic form, so then variations can embellish it. And so in the Baroque period, that was a lot of the technique was having to do with melodic embellishment over the basic chord progression, which typically wouldn't change very much. The length of the phrases, the total number of phrases, and basically the tempos, they would all remain more or less the same, and then you would just have melodic embellishment. So but what we'll see is that this becomes then one of the standard forms that a composer can use in a sonata cycle work, and those become especially important in the classical era with the classical symphony and chamber music such as string quartets and other types of instrumentation for chamber music, solo piano sonatas and so forth. So you'll see theme variation that's used in like the second movement of a sonata cycle work, like classical symphony. That second movement very often has contrasting key and contrasting tempo. Usually it's the slowest of the 4 movements. And you could find some examples of theme variation. Same thing in the final movement, that composers could use that form as well. So with Mozart and Haydn, there are certain features of their works that I'm going to talk about. And then with Beethoven, you're going to see that Beethoven really takes theme variation to another place, which was not something anticipated by Mozart and Haydn in the way that they use theme and variation. And really, all of the great composers, so thinking of the 3 Bs, Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, they were all incredible masters of theme and variation form. So I think what I'll do first is talk about different types of variation techniques, and so this is just summarizing what is discussed in the Stein textbook. So there are 4 basic types that Stein talks about. And so the first of these is called strophic variation. So you might remember that term strophic from music literature, and that was a type of structure in the leader that we looked at that basically had a single melody that was used for several different strophes or several different verses. And sometimes you have a refrain at the end, you know, a returning refrain. But the idea of strophic has to do with, a returning element. So in this category of strophic, what Stein is getting at is represented by the da capo aria. So this is a structure that develops in opera at the end of the 17th century. And so Alessandro Scarlatti in Naples develops this with his opera seria. And it becomes a really, really important type of form associated with the opera. And so it is so popular that by the middle of the 18th century, with a composer like Gluck, who is responsible for what was called opera reform, one of the things that he said was that no da capo aria. So they used it so much that he was making this new proposal in writing operas that you didn't use that Baroque form anymore. But one of the things that happened was with this form, you had basically a ternary pattern. It's an opening A section. We're going to hear an example in a moment from a Handel opera, Julius Caesar. And this particular da capo aria starts with an orchestral ritornello. So it's a little opening passage for the string orchestra that introduces the aria, and that is going to come back a couple of times in this opening A section. So you remember the idea of ritornello form with concerto, having to do with the returning theme. So this opening section then would be followed by contrasting B section, and that would have new thematic material, and sometimes it would change keys, and so we're going to hear this do that. At the end of the B section then, you had a da capo, which indicated a restatement of the opening A section, and then the variation idea comes into play with the da capo that the singer would embellish the return of the A section. And it was a vehicle for virtuosic display, and so that was one of the things that kind of was, really popular, and in some, opinions that it was abused, and what led to Gluck finally, making the statement, we're not going to write any more da capo arias like that. So, what we're going to hear in this recording is the return of the opening A, and it will be abbreviated, so it won't be the whole thing, but you'll hear the restatement of the ritornello in the string orchestra. And this is the great coloratura soprano Beverly Sills, who then does an embellishment of the return of the A section. It's very tastefully done, but when you hear this recording, you want to pay close attention to the opening presentation, so that when then you hear the da capo and her embellishment, you can kind of pick up on exactly what's going on. So we're going to listen to this example from Handel's Julius Caesar, and this is an aria. The title is Non Disperar, and so we'll listen to this, and you can get a feeling for this type of context for this variation technique. Next one takes it out. Leading up to the short cadenza. Final ritornello. All right, so that's a great example of a Baroque da capo aria and a good example of this strophic variation type. So, oops, we're going to stop there. All right, that's going to be our next example. So, that leads right into the second type, which is the type that is associated with paired dances. So as you know, the dance was a really important source for instrumental music in the Baroque. And toward the second half of the Baroque era, you remember from Music Book that we talked a little bit about the Sonata da Camera of Corelli, which was a collection of dances. And you remember that the dances were in binary form. And then by the time that J.S. Bach was writing collections of dances, by the end of the Baroque era, then they had evolved into this set of dances that would include the Allemande, Courante, Sarabande, and Gigue. Typically, those would be the four standard dances. Earlier, though, than Bach, in the first half of the Baroque, composers liked to to pair dances together. And so what a composer would do would be to write, an example would be like an Allemande and a Courante. And as you know, those become the first two standard dances. But earlier, these were standalone couples, paired dances. And so what would happen is that Baroque composers, you remember, basically wanted to maintain a single emotion, a single affect within one particular movement. And so that was the situation with the dance. It was basically, one idea that would be continuously developed. And each dance type had its own meter, specific characteristic, tempo, or even texture, but that would remain one basic idea in that particular dance, and then it would be coupled with something that served as a sense of contrast. So you basically would have an opening dance that would be slower and duple or quadruple meter. And then that would be paired with the second dance that would be faster and triple or compound meter. So something like the Allemande and the Courante are a good example of paired dances. Another example would be the pavane, and the Galliard. And we're actually going to listen to an example of the pavane and Galliard from the Fitzwilliam Virgil book, that great anthology of British keyboard music from the beginning of the 17th century. And we're going to listen to an example by William Byrd, who's one of the greatest composers from England in the Baroque. And the reason that this, then, I'm talking about in the context of theme and variation, is because very often composers would take the same theme that you hear in the first dance, and they would use that same theme and just change the meter, change the tempo, dress it up a little bit, and that would be then what would happen in the second dance. So that is another example of variation technique. So we're going to listen to this excerpt here from this Pavane and Galliard by William Byrd. And so we're going to listen to the very beginning of the Pavane, and you'll hear how that is how then the Galliard begins. So when you hear the harmonies of this, it definitely has still kind of a Renaissance modal feel to it. Really like the harmonies in these works in the Fitzwilliam Virgil book. Okay, let's listen to this. It sounds like it switches between major and minor.